Have you ever gone through something and you feel like you're all alone? You ever been in a crowd and yet felt lonely? What are your actions when you're lonely? Charles Colson shares a story I'd like to share with you about a guy by the name of Clayton Longtree. Clayton Longtree was lonely in Moscow. The weather was dreary. The Marine barracks were dirty, old, and cold, and he didn't get much mail. Though guard duty at the U.S. Embassy was a trusted position of honor, his work was often dull and exhausting. It was a ceremonial job with little action. In letters home, he doodled U.S. planes dropping bombs on Red Square. He tried writing to an old girlfriend only to learn that she'd married someone else. It was when Clayton met Violetta in the fall of 1985 that life in Moscow began to brighten. Tall, fair-skinned, and beautiful, she was a translator at the embassy. Though Clayton had been warned about fraternizing with the Soviets, he had enough friends and superiors date Russian women to feel comfortable doing the same. He and Violetta took long walks in the park, had tea, even managed to be alone a few times in her apartment. Violetta introduced Clayton to her Uncle Sasha, who peppered him with questions about his life in the United States, his political views, life in Moscow, and life in the embassy. Clayton enjoyed the older man's interest. Then one day, Sasha pulled a prepared list of detailed questions from his pocket, and Clayton finally realized that Violetta's uncle worked for the KGB. But Clayton kept meeting with Violetta and with Sasha. He began making excuses to his superiors, using elaborate techniques to make sure he wasn't being followed when he met with his Russian friends. Life became more interesting, more like the spy novels Clayton loved to read. After he'd been seeing Violetta for 6 months, Clayton's Moscow tour came to a close. He asked to be reassigned to guard duty at the U.S. Embassy in Vienna. Clayton Longtree was lonely in Vienna. But soon Uncle Sasha arrived, bearing photographs and a letter from Violetta. As he watched the young Marine excitedly rip open the package, Sasha knew Clayton was ready for something more than just a talk. The first item Clayton delivered to the KGB agent was an old embassy phone book. Next came a map of the embassy interior for which Clayton received $1,800. He used 1,000 of it to buy Violetta a handmade Viennese gown. Then came 3 photographs of embassy employees thought to be CIA agents and another $1,800 payment. Sasha proposed an undercover trip back to Moscow where Clayton could at least visit Violetta and receive KGB training. Clayton arranged for vacation leave from the embassy. But now he began to get nervous. He started to drink more. He lay awake nights trying to think of a way out of the KGB web. He hadn't realized that when he traded the trust of his nation for sex and cash, he traded his soul as well. So in December 1986, Clayton tried to trade it back. At a Christmas party, he approached the Vienna CIA chief, a man whose real identity he would not have known except for Uncle Sasha had pointed him out earlier. "I'm in something over my head," he said. The confession began that evening, ended in August 1987, when Clayton Longtree was found guilty on all charges of espionage. Today he sits in a military prison cell, a 30-year sentence stretching before him. Loneliness is defined as being without company or cut off from others, by Webster. Look at what great lengths Clayton Longtree went to try to keep himself from loneliness. He was willing to trade in his country. Jesus also had a time of loneliness, but his reaction was much different. Look at Mark chapter 14, verses Jesus quote states that the shepherd will be struck. What does it mean to strike a shepherd? First, what does it mean to be a shepherd? A shepherd is someone who takes care of sheep. A shepherd is not a shepherd without sheep. The sheep are dependent on the survival of their survival by the shepherd. Without the care of the shepherd, the sheep, they'll just all die. It might be predators that come in and scatter the sheep before attacking the one they want. It might be that illness takes the sheep out because there was no shepherd to guide the sheep to good drinking water. You see, sheep will drink whatever water they can find at the time they're thirsty. They would drink from a parasite-ridden puddle, even if just over the hill there is good spring water. It might be those insects making them go mad, causing for their death. You see, a shepherd anoints the head of the sheep in order to keep the insects from entering the sheep's nose. These insects would then lay eggs that would eventually hatch, and a larva would make their way up in the sheep's brain. This would cause for the sheep to go mad, which would eventually cause for its demise. What we see is that sheep are very dependent on the shepherd. When Jesus quotes Zechariah here, he's referring to himself being the shepherd. And this was not uncommon of Jesus. He's called himself the shepherd multiple times in his ministry. Specifically in John 10, Jesus calls himself the good shepherd twice and makes other references to himself being a shepherd. This prophecy from Zechariah says that the shepherd will be struck, and boy, was Jesus struck. The issue is not whether Jesus was struck or not, bringing fulfillment to this prophecy. The issue is which time. You see, Jesus was struck by his own disciple when he was betrayed. He was struck by fists of the Sanhedrin, the religious governing body of that day. He was blindfolded. He was struck by the guards of Pilate, and he was flogged. He was struck by the soldiers with a crown of thorns, as well as striking him on the head again and again. We obviously cannot forget how he was struck by the nails and the cross. So which time was Zechariah prophesying about? I would say any and all of them. Jesus, the shepherd, was definitely struck. But look at the second part of the prophecy. Look specifically at the second part of verse 27. That are being referred to here. Well, if the definition of a shepherd is one who cares for sheep, and if Jesus is the good shepherd, then the sheep would be his followers. I'd like to focus more closely to the 12. Now we see where Zechariah states the sheep will be scattered when the shepherd is struck. We've just looked at how Jesus, the shepherd, was struck many times. So at what point did the disciples scatter? It's a difficult question to answer because it happened in multiple times. Many of the disciples scattered the moment Jesus was betrayed by Judas and taken from the garden to stand trial before the Sanhedrin. It seems that of the remaining 11 disciples, they all scattered except for 2 at that point. And I say the 11 disciples because Judas has already scattered when he betrayed Jesus. The only 2 that sort of stuck around was Peter and John. It appears, according to John 18, that John had some connections that he used to get Peter and himself into the high priest court. It appeared that when John went further in and Peter was left at the courtyard by himself, this is when we begin to see the scattering of Peter. If you remember in our text in Mark that Jesus told Peter that he would deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed twice, Peter did deny Jesus 3 times while in this courtyard. He denied Jesus to a servant girl once, to a small crowd standing nearby with that same servant girl questioning him again once. And lastly, he denied Jesus to the crowd as they questioned him once. 3 times. 3 times Peter disowned Jesus. It appears that right after the 3rd denial, the rooster crowed the 2nd time, and Peter remembered what Jesus said and ran away, weeping. But in Luke chapter 22, it's recorded that Jesus looked straight at Peter. And then Peter remembered Jesus' words before leaving, crying bitterly. So 1 scattered by betraying Jesus, 9 scattered when Jesus was taken to the high priest, 1 more scattered when the rooster crowed the second time, and the last one scattered when Jesus was taken to Pilate. Although this one was still present when Jesus was crucified, and he was standing next to Jesus' mother. There you have it. All 12 disciples scattered, and they left Jesus to stand before his accusers all alone. The prophecy came true. The shepherd, Jesus, was struck, and the sheep, the disciples, all scattered. There's a lesson in this. Actually, there are 2 lessons in this. The first one that we typically would not see in these circumstances. Now, earlier, we talked a bit about the power of loneliness. We told the story of a man named Clayton Lonetree. We saw in this story how he was willing to sell out information about his own country to have a relationship to keep him from this loneliness. What we may not understand about Jesus' situation is he too faced this loneliness. When Jesus was taken by the mob to the Sanhedrin, 10 of his followers had scattered. By the end of the night, all 12 disciples scattered. In their scattering, Jesus was left all alone. Yet in his loneliness, he did not do anything wrong like Clayton did. Even through his loneliness, Jesus remained faithful to God and to God's will. You see, it was God's will for Jesus to die that day. Not for anything that he had done wrong, but for all the things that we had done wrong. In his loneliness, Jesus kept his eyes on the Father and what the Father wanted. I too, at one time, have faced this great loneliness. You see, when I was younger, I had my life all planned out. I was going to go to college. I was going to meet the love of my life, and right after graduation, I would get married, and I'd begin my life as a preacher of the gospel. But when graduation came around, there was no love of my life. So I began my first ministry in a state that I told God I would never go. Don't ever tell God what you're going to do. Some even call it a different country. I began my ministry in the state of Kentucky. And actually, many Kentuckians would take offense to my last statement because Kentucky is not a state, it's a commonwealth. While there, I began my ministry in a small church of about 35 people. There was only one girl my age, and she was dating another guy. So here I was in the state of Kentucky, the Commonwealth of Kentucky, serving at a church that didn't have any girls my age available. How was I to find the love of my life? You see, I began to have these feelings of great loneliness. I was partly to blame for these feelings of loneliness, though, and I was very well aware of this. You see, I had from the time I began dating back in high school viewed dating differently than the rest of society. For me, and this is what I teach the next generation, for me, dating is a way to find who you want to marry. If you're not in a position to marry someone, then you should not date. That's my take on it. So for my days in high school, when I went on a date with a girl, I would look at myself in a mirror and ask myself, with all I know about this girl, could I marry her? If the answer was yes, I would continue to date her. If the answer was no, I would end it. Now, some would call me extremely picky. Actually, one of my good friends from back home was dying to meet Tia when we were engaged to get married. And she told Tia that she had to meet her because she must be close to perfect for me to want to marry her. Because she had tried setting me up with numerous girls, all of which I stopped dating shortly after starting. This pickiness is what I understood was causing my loneliness. But I didn't want to back away from what I was doing. Instead, I asked for God to send me the girl he wanted me to marry. And shortly after that, Tia started coming to the church I was serving at. Now, it took me another 10 months to understand God's plan with this, but that's another story for another time. What I'm trying to tell you is, if you are faithful to God and to God's will in your time of loneliness, God will work it all out, just like he did for Jesus. For while Jesus was lonely, while he did die on the cross, he rose from the grave on the third day. And shortly after that, Jesus would ascend into heaven, where he now sits at God's right hand. See, the first lesson we see in all of this is that being faithful to God in our loneliness will bring an answer for our loneliness. The second lesson we see comes from all the disciples who were scattered except for one. You see, once Judas betrayed Jesus, he had crossed a line that prevented him from coming back. And we talked about this just a few weeks ago. But all the other 11 disciples came back to Jesus. Just like their scattering was done in waves, their coming back to Jesus was also done in waves. It appears that 9 of them came back to Jesus when Jesus visited them in the room after his resurrection. Thomas came back to Jesus after Jesus appeared again and showed him the scars from the crucifixion. And lastly, Peter came back to Jesus when he met him on the shore after fishing. Peter jumped out of the boat when he realized it was Jesus on the shore, and he swam ashore. And while there, Jesus asked Peter to take care of the sheep. Jesus asked Peter to become a shepherd. Every one of the 11 disciples, even though they scattered when the shepherd was struck, every one of the 11 disciples made their way back to Jesus. We took a look at a prophecy given by Zechariah. We saw that the shepherd was struck, and Jesus was struck many times. We also saw how the sheep were scattered after that. We saw how this happened in waves, but in the end, Jesus was standing alone to face the punishment for our sins. And we took some time to look at 2 lessons that we learned from this. The first lesson is simply, if you're facing loneliness, be faithful to God and to his will, and he'll work it all out. The second lesson is simply, if you've scattered like the disciples, you can come back. Now, I know that just a few weeks ago we talked about some that crossed God's line. We saw how Judas crossed a line, how those who blasphemed the Holy Spirit crossed a line, and how the believers in Hebrews chapter 6 crossed a line by falling away. We also saw how each and every one of those were all intentional actions. Not one of these can be committed accidentally, but rather purposefully. You cannot accidentally cross God's line. But it may be that what describes you is more what the author of Hebrews writes in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1. Drifting away is something completely different than crossing God's line. If we're in a boat and we've done something to realize that we have drifted, all we have to do is to grab the oars and paddle our way back to God. Or if you're one of those fortunate ones, you turn the motor back on and steer yourself back to God. If this describes you, won't you consider that today? You pray with me. God, we see the passion that Peter